They told me to leave the past alone. That some doors, once closed, should never be opened again, especially not the ones sealed by silence and shame. But the thing about silence is that it echoes louder the longer you ignore it. That's what I learned the day I stood at the gate of my late father's old village house, the one no one in my family spoke about, the one I'd only seen once in a faded photograph buried deep in my mother's Bible. I wasn't here for nostalgia. I came because the lawyer said the land title had finally cleared, and as the only surviving heir, I had to go and inspect. Simple enough. In and out. Sell it. Get back to Lagos before the week was over. But I should have known better. From the moment I stepped off the bus into that heat-drenched village air, I felt it, the unease, the side glances, the unspoken history clinging to every crack in the compound walls. And then she appeared. Barefoot. Hair tangled like roots. Eyes too clear to belong to someone they called Mad. She stood in front of the gate like a warning sent by something older than law, pointing one bony finger at me. "Don't enter that house," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "If you do, you will not come out the same." I stared at her for a moment, long enough to consider the strange weight in her words. Then I reached into my pocket, found the keys and opened the gate anyway. Welcome to Luxurious Echoes. Make sure you like and subscribe. Let's get into the story. I got the call on a Tuesday, right after a client meeting in Lekki Phase 1. My phone buzzed against the polished mahogany of the boardroom table, and I picked it up out of habit, already preparing a polite excuse to call back later. But when I heard the name Barrister Ojo, the man who had handled my late father's affairs, my mouth went dry. He spoke in the stiff, formal tone lawyers love, but there was something cautious beneath it, like even he wasn't sure how I'd take the news. "Your father left behind a property in Adoha village," he said. "A family compound. The documents are in order now. He named you sole beneficiary." My first instinct was irritation. That man had left me with nothing but unfinished business when he passed. No apologies, no closure, just a funeral where people shook my hand like I was inheriting a legacy instead of trauma. What am I supposed to do with a mud house in the middle of nowhere? I muttered, though I hadn't been to Adoha since I was 10. Ojo didn't answer directly. "It might be worth more than you think," he said, then added, "Just inspect it. Decide later." I sighed. I had projects in Yaba and Ibadan, 2 delayed approvals, and a headache that hadn't gone away in weeks. But I agreed, if only to cross one more thing off the emotional to-do list my father had left behind. I had no intention of staying long. Fly in, take pictures, ask the local chief a few questions, sell it to some spiritual retreat or cocoa startup. That was the plan. It was the packing that made it feel real. I kept it light, 1 duffel bag, a laptop, some files I never opened, and the suit my father was buried in, still dry-cleaned in plastic. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I thought being in the house would remind me of him, and I wanted to be prepared to bury that feeling again if it resurfaced. Lagos traffic was its usual punishment, but once I got out past the toll gates and the urban chaos started thinning into fields and open skies, I felt something unfamiliar, relief. I didn't know how tense I'd become until the land itself seemed to loosen me. Adoha was smaller than I remembered. The roads had improved but the houses hadn't. Brown earth, corrugated roofs, narrow paths lined with whispering trees and kids who watched my car like I was a mobile cinema. When I got to the compound, it was already late afternoon. The sun hung low, fat and orange, casting long shadows across the ground. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the gate. It wasn't large or impressive. In fact, it was rusted at the hinges, vines curling around the edges. But standing there, I felt something strange in my chest, like I'd just stepped into a story I didn't remember writing. My cousin Kunnel was waiting for me at the house next door, dressed in a faded Chelsea jersey and slippers too thin to protect against gravel. He gave me the kind of hug men reserve for funerals and land disputes, brief, chest out, eyes watching. He didn't offer to carry my bag. "You sure you want to stay inside the house?" he asked as we crossed the dusty path leading to the compound. I paused. "Why wouldn't I?" He shrugged. "People just say things." That was all. Not a full warning, not a story. Just things. The compound was larger than I expected. A rectangular block with 3 rooms, a side kitchen and a crumbling chicken coop. The paint was gone, the windows dull with dust, but the walls stood like they had something to prove. I stepped onto the veranda and tried the door. It groaned open. The air inside hit me like a sealed jar of time. So, the kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful. I dropped my bag in the main room and took a slow look around. Wooden furniture, a rusted fan, calendars from a decade ago. But it wasn't just the decor. It was a sense low in my gut that this house wasn't empty. It was just waiting. The villagers didn't treat me like family. They treated me like a question. Old men looked away when I greeted them. Women nodded but didn't smile. Children peeked at me from corners, curious but silent. I walked to the small provision store near the church and bought a bag of pure water just to start a conversation. The woman behind the counter asked if I was Papa Toby's boy. I said yes. She didn't ask more. As I walked back, the late sun casting everything in gold, I saw a figure sitting by the corner of the compound fence. Barefoot. Hair wild like tangled fishing net. Her wrapper was stained and loose, her eyes too focused for someone they called mad. I slowed, unsure. She rose slowly like she'd been waiting for me. When she reached me, she didn't ask my name. She just pointed to the house. "Don't enter that house," she said. Her voice was cracked like stone dragged over wood. I blinked at her. "Why?" I asked, trying not to laugh. Her eyes met mine, dark and deep, and her voice dropped lower. "If you enter, you will not come out the same." Then she turned and walked away, dragging her feet like someone pulling the weight of truth behind her. I stood there longer than I'd admit, watching her walk away. Something about the way she said it, without fear, without hurry, made it stick. I wanted to dismiss it as village theatrics, superstition wrapped in madness, the kind of story people tell to spice up boredom. But it wasn't just the words. It was the certainty in her voice, like she wasn't warning me as a stranger, but as someone tied to something she already knew would happen. Still, I shook it off. I'd lived in Lagos long enough to build immunity to drama. I pushed open the compound gate again and walked back in, stubborn in the way only sons of proud fathers learn to be. The evening breeze had shifted. The air smelled like burnt leaves and something faintly sweet, like old perfume. I locked the gate behind me. Whatever this place had been, it was mine now. I wasn't going to be chased off by a woman who slept under trees and whispered riddles. But that night, when I finally lay on the old mattress in the master bedroom, I didn't sleep easy. My dreams were fragmented and damp, full of doors that wouldn't open and lullabies sung in voices I didn't recognize but somehow mourned. The house creaked like it was remembering things. I kept hearing faint sounds, a knock, a footstep, a sigh. I told myself it was wind. What? Imagination. But at 3:17 a.m. I sat up sharply. There was a hum. Soft. Full. It came from the locked inner room across the hallway. A humming sound like a woman lulling a child to sleep. It stopped when I stood up. I held my breath. The air was thick. I walked to the door and placed my hand on the knob. Lock. I rattled it once, gently. It didn't move. I backed away and returned to bed, my skin cold. I didn't sleep again that night. And in the morning I found something I hadn't noticed the day before, a small scratch mark on the corridor wall. It wasn't random. It looked like a tally. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause. 1. 5 marks. Scratched deep like someone counting days. Or years. I stared at it for a long time, then ran my fingers over the grooves. It was too precise to be accidental. That was when I started to wonder if the house wasn't just hiding something. Maybe it had been witness to something. Maybe that madwoman hadn't been warning me for her sake. Maybe it had been for mine. The next morning I stood in front of the inner door, staring at it like it owed me something. It was narrow, wooden, with a corroded lock and no visible keyhole. I tried opening it the night before and again after my second cup of coffee, but it didn't budge. The more I stared at it, the more it stared back. I didn't come here looking for ghosts or drama. I came for answers, numbers, a property estimate I could slap on a document and forget about. But this house, my father's house, wasn't interested in being forgotten. I wanted to be known. I took a slow walk around the compound, hoping sunlight would shrink my imagination. I examined the floor near the back window and heard a hollow echo beneath the tiles. Curious, I pushed aside an old mat and found a patch of loose wood. Underneath was an empty crawl space. Or so I thought. I reached in and pulled out a dusty tin box. Inside, a small comb with broken teeth, a rusted hairpin, and a folded piece of cloth embroidered with the initials AO. My mother's initials. I sat back, my breath snagging. Why would her things be hidden beneath the floor of a house she supposedly abandoned? I called Cunnel that afternoon. He came with 2 sachets of dry gin and a forced smile. What was Mama doing here? I asked him directly, holding up the cloth. His expression froze. That's old news, Toby. Let sleeping dogs lie. But I didn't want dogs. I wanted truth. I pressed harder, asking what he knew, what he remembered. He mumbled something about my mother having a breakdown before she left, something about her being sent to stay here for cleansing. That word, cleansing, tightened around my throat like rope. Cleansing from what? I demanded. But Kunnel wouldn't answer. He drank his gin, wiped his mouth and said, "If you want peace, sell the house and go. This place doesn't forget things easily." That night I couldn't sit still. I paced. I checked the windows. The humming didn't come again, but the silence was worse. At 2:45 a.m., I heard a faint scratching like someone dragging fingernails across the wall outside my room. I rushed out with a flashlight, heart banging, and saw nothing. But when I turned back, I saw a shadow behind the curtain inside. Someone or something had been watching from within. I threw open the curtain, ready to confront madness, but the room was empty. And on the bed? A single long strand of gray hair, curled like a question mark on my pillow. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the main sitting room, light on, fan wheezing above my head like a tired man's breath. I kept replaying everything: my mother's cloth under the floorboards, the scratch marks on the wall, the gray hair. Rationality was beginning to fray and I hated it. I prided myself on being the kind of man who didn't jump at shadows. I was raised to believe in logic, not spirits. But logic was beginning to feel useless in a place where time moved sideways and truth came in pieces. By dawn, the house felt colder, even with the heat outside. I stepped out to the front veranda and found a bowl of collards placed on the doorstep, fresh, reddish-brown, split clean. No note. No explanation. Just sitting there like an offering. I scanned the compound but saw no one. Not Kunnel. Not the Madwoman. Only a red-chested lizard perched on the edge of the roof, tail twitching like it had something to say but wouldn't dare speak. I didn't touch the collards. I stepped over them and walked out into the village. I found Adiz that morning, though I didn't know her name yet. She was sweeping the front of the small school building near the main junction, her wrapper tied high around her waist, her hair pulled into a simple puff. She looked up when she saw me and offered a polite, cautious smile, not the kind women give Lagos men they're trying to impress, but the kind that says, "I see you but I don't trust you yet." I greeted her, introduced myself, and asked casually if she knew anything about the house, my father's house. Her eyes shifted slightly, like she wanted to answer but had learned not to. "I only came to this village 3 years ago," she said. "I hear things. But I listen more than I speak." I nodded, about to thank her and walk away, but then she added, almost softly, "Some houses don't need visitors. They need witnesses." That line followed me all the way back to the compound. Witnesses. Not buyers. Not heirs. Witnesses. As I approached the front gate, the collards were gone. Not stepped on. Not disturbed. Just gone. I entered the house again, this time slower, my feet aware of every creak beneath them. And as I shut the door behind me, a wind passed through the corridor, gentle, deliberate, and carrying that same faint scent of perfume from the first night. Not new. Not pleasant. Familiar. And deeply, painfully human. I saw her again 2 days later at the small primary school near the village stream. The children were scattered across the bare compound, playing with bottle caps and sticks, their laughter slicing through the thick air like birdsong. She stood beside the wooden structure that passed for a staff room, adjusting the hem of her skirt as she handed out exercise books. There was a calmness in her posture, anchored, like someone who had found her balance in a world that didn't offer much of it. I approached her with the intention of being polite and nothing more. "Morning," I said. "I'm Toby." She looked up from her clipboard, gave me a once-over with eyes that didn't flinch, and nodded. "I know," she replied. No further curiosity, no small talk. Just observation wrapped in quiet strength. I found myself hesitating, then gesturing vaguely toward the direction of my compound. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" I asked. Her gaze didn't waver. "This is a village. We don't have news channels. We have memories." I almost laughed, but something about the way she said it made me feel exposed, like I was the story, not the outsider investigating one. She didn't invite me to sit, but I did anyway, on a worn cement block under the mango tree. I told her about the house, well, some of it. Not the hair on the pillow or the perfume in the corridor, but enough for her to understand I wasn't sleeping well. "Sometimes houses don't want to be left empty," she said quietly. "Especially when they're still owed truth." That line hit somewhere I wasn't ready to name. I asked her how long she'd lived here. She said she was transferred from Nsukka after the death of her father and decided not to leave after her posting expired. "Udoha holds on to people," she said, her tone unreadable. "The question is whether it's by love or by force." We talked a bit longer, about nothing urgent really, but in those 30 minutes I felt more human than I had in days. She didn't offer pity and she didn't press for more. That night, I sat on the veranda of the compound with a kerosene lantern beside me, her words still circling in my head. I looked at the house, not the walls, not the locks, but the thing behind them. Maybe this wasn't just a place to clean up and sell. Maybe this was a wound. One that hadn't stopped bleeding. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't sent here to fix it. Maybe I was sent here to finally see it. The door haunted me. Not with sounds or movement, but with absence. Every time I passed it, I felt like it was listening to my footsteps, taking attendance. I had tried every key I found in drawers and cupboards, even ones that clearly belonged to padlocks long gone. Nothing fit. One morning, I pushed against it with both hands, hoping brute force would succeed where finesse failed. It didn't budge. The wood was swollen with age, its hinges rusted into the frame like bone into flesh. I even considered calling a carpenter, but Cunnell laughed when I brought it up. "That door?" he said over the rim of his plastic cup. "Leave it alone, Toby. Some things are better forgotten." His voice had a finality I didn't like. I pressed him for more, but he waved me off with a weak joke about ghosts and village gossip. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the house again, looking for a back entrance, a loose window, anything that might bypass that door. Nothing. It was as if the house had sealed that room away deliberately, like a tongue hiding a bitter truth between its teeth. So I turned to questions. Discreetly, at first, chatting with the older men under the tree by the palm wine shed, slipping a few lines of inquiry into small talk. Most deflected. Some narrowed their eyes. One finally said, "If you value your name, don't go stirring the dead, son of Adoniram." That was the first time someone used my father's name like a threat instead of a compliment. I began to realize the house wasn't just a building. It was a border between memory and myth, between the story my family told and the one the village buried. The next morning, I found fresh chalk markings on the ground just outside the inner door. Tiny white circles. Symbols I didn't recognize. I bent to touch one and a voice startled me. "Don't clean it." I turned, Adiz, standing at the entrance in a mustard blouse and plain wrapper, her face calm but alert. "Someone left that for protection," she said. "Or warning." I stared at her. "You believe all this?" Her answer was quiet. "I believe the pain people bury when they have nowhere else to put it. And sometimes it stains the walls." That night, I dreamed of the door opening, but instead of finding a room, I found a mirror. And in the reflection, I wasn't standing alone. I found her again near the village well, sitting on the ground with her feet in the sand, tracing shapes with a twig. The other women fetching water ignored her presence like she was furniture, but I watched how they glanced at her from the corners of their eyes. I approached slowly, unsure if she'd even recognize me. But she did. She didn't flinch when I crouched beside her. Didn't look up. Just whispered, "You open the gate. Now the house wants you to open the rest." Her voice was hoarse like a radio stuck between stations. "Did you know my mother?" I asked. She didn't reply immediately, only tilted her head. "Adama. That was her name. Beautiful and stubborn. They said she brought shame, but it was the shame of men who needed her silence." Her words crawled over my skin. I wanted to press further, but she closed her hand over mine so fast it startled me. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't stop, but don't go alone," she said. "The house doesn't just remember, it reminds." Later that day I asked Adiz about her. "They call her Nkiru," she told me. "She's been like this for years. Lives behind the old shrine where no one goes. Some say she was once a nurse. Others say she saw something she shouldn't have. Either way, people pretend she doesn't exist." I didn't want to pretend. That evening, I brought Nkiru a meal, boiled yam and palm oil. She didn't say thank you, but she let me sit beside her. We didn't speak much, but she hummed a song that made my eyes sting. It was the same one I'd heard through the locked door. Same rhythm. Same haunting rise and fall. I didn't ask how she knew it. I just listened. And for the first time since I entered that house, I felt like I wasn't the one uncovering secrets. I was the one being remembered. I didn't find it. It found me. One morning, I opened a cupboard in the kitchen to retrieve a cup, and the entire shelf gave way. Behind it, hidden in the dark hollow where a wooden plank had rotted through, was a small tin box wrapped in cloth. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. Inside were brittle pages, old letters, a photo torn in half, and a child's beaded bracelet. The letters were unsigned, but the handwriting looked familiar. I compared it to my mother's old prayer notes I found years ago in a Bible she left behind. It matched. The photo showed her, younger, sitting on the steps of this same house, belly swollen with pregnancy. There was a shadow beside her, faint but unmistakable. A man. Face half-cropped. But the bracelet told me the story wasn't about the adults. It was about someone else. Someone who was here. Someone who didn't make it out. I sat on the floor of that kitchen for hours, the letters spread around me like pieces of a broken map. Each one hinted at pain, confinement, and something taken without consent. Words like purification, unfit mother, shame, and obedience surfaced again and again. These weren't love letters. They were records of survival. Adiz came by in the afternoon and found me like that. She didn't ask questions. She just knelt beside me and helped me gather the papers, her fingers gentle. "The house isn't haunting you," she said. "It's trying to speak." And for the first time I let it. I didn't fight the wave. I allowed myself to cry not because of ghosts, but because the woman I called a runaway might have been a prisoner. And I was the first in a long time willing to listen. It wasn't a meeting. It was a performance. Chief Alabi sent a message through Kunnal, asking me to join him for cola and conversation. His compound was 3 times the size of ours, with cement lions guarding the gate and 2 young men in polo shirts watching from the veranda. Inside, he wore a white agbada too pristine for comfort, his eyes hidden behind tinted glasses even though the sun had begun to set. He smiled like a man who had already written my script. "So, the prodigal son returns," he said. I kept my response polite but brief. He asked about Lagos, my job, my plans for the compound. I told him I hadn't decided. "Ah," he said, cracking a cola nut. "But decisions must be made quickly. Land is like a woman. Leave her alone too long and someone else will claim her." I smiled tightly. He leaned in, his voice soft. "That house, your father's house, it is important. But importance is not always the same as value." He didn't mention my mother. He didn't need to. The implication hovered like heat. "If you wish," he said, "I can help you sell it." Discreetly. "Let the past rest. Let the land serve a new purpose." My chest tightened. "What happened in that house?" I asked, cutting through the pretense. His smile faltered for a blink, then returned. "What happens in any house? Life, death, secrets. But none of it matters if no one remembers." I left that evening with my blood boiling, the papers in my pocket feeling heavier than stone. That night, I sat in the living room with a single lantern, watching the shadows flicker across the walls. I whispered into the dark, "I remember." And for the first time I felt the house exhale. Adiz was the first person who noticed that I was no longer sleeping like a normal human being. It wasn't something I told her. It showed in the way my eyes lingered too long on nothing, in the pauses that crept into my sentences like missing teeth, in the way my hands sometimes trembled when I reached for my cup of tea. She invited me to walk with her one evening after school, along the narrow footpath that ran behind the farms, where cassava leaves brushed against our legs and the air smelled of damp earth and smoke. We didn't talk much at first. That was the thing with Adiz, she didn't rush silence. She treated it like something alive, something that would speak when it was ready. Eventually she asked me how the house was treating me. I laughed but the sound came out wrong, brittle. "Like an old relative that smiles too much," I said. "You know, the kind that knows something about you and is waiting for the right moment to remind you." She nodded slowly as if that made perfect sense. Then she told me about other houses in the village, places people avoided, not because they were haunted, but because too many truths had been buried in them. "Pain doesn't disappear just because people agree not to talk about it," she said. "It settles. It waits." As we walked, she shared fragments of village history, not gossip, not accusations, just patterns. Women who were sent away and came back quiet. Men who rose quickly in influence after resolving community problems. Children who were raised by relatives without explanations. She never once mentioned my mother directly, but every word circled her like a satellite. I realized listening to her that what frightened me most wasn't the house anymore, it was how normal everything sounded when explained calmly. That night, when I returned to the compound, I saw the scratch marks on the wall differently. Not as signs of madness or fear, but as proof of endurance. Someone had been alive enough to count time. And for the first time, I admitted something I hadn't allowed myself to say. I was scared not of what I would find, but of what I already knew and could no longer unknow. Adiz hadn't tried to save me. She had simply seen me clearly. And somehow, that made it harder to pretend I was still in control. I started rebuilding my mother's timeline the way I handled difficult projects in Lagos, methodically, obsessively, with no room for sentiment. Dates, locations, witnesses. But unlike spreadsheets, memory didn't obey structure. It came in pieces. My aunt remembered the day my mother was sent away for rest. A neighbor remembered seeing her heavily pregnant when she supposedly had no husband around. Kunnal remembered being warned never to ask questions. None of it matched the story I grew up with, the story of a woman who abandoned her family out of weakness or shame. When I confronted my aunt, she cried before I even finished speaking. She said she was told it was for my mother's own good. That elders knew best. That resistance would only bring more trouble. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat there and realized something painful. Silence hadn't been ignorance. It had been fear. That night, I went through the letters again. Slowly. Carefully. I noticed how my mother never wrote about leaving. She wrote about waiting. About enduring. About hoping someone would remember she existed. One letter mentioned a child, not directly but in a way that made my chest tighten. He cries at night, she wrote. I count his breaths when I cannot count my own. I dropped the paper like it burned me. I had always been an only child. That was a fact I never questioned. But facts I was learning were often curated. I sat on the floor until dawn, my back against the wall, realizing that my entire understanding of my mother had been shaped by other people's comfort. And the house had held her truth all along. It hadn't been calling me out of cruelty. It had been calling me because I was her son. Because blood remembers what mouths refuse to say. The door didn't open dramatically. There was no thunder, no sudden rush of cold air. It opened with a tired groan, like something that had waited too long and finally given up resisting. I don't even remember how I unlocked it, only that my hands were steady in a way they hadn't been for days. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. Bare. Almost polite in its emptiness. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw the walls. Scratches everywhere. Some deep. Some shallow. Words carved and erased and carved again. Dates. Please. Names. And in one corner, faint but unmistakable, a child's handprint painted in ash. My knees gave way. I didn't fall dramatically. I folded. Quietly. Like someone whose body had received news before his mind caught up. There were restraints embedded in the wall, old, rusted, undeniable. A thin mattress on the floor. A small tin cup, nothing supernatural. Nothing ambiguous. Just evidence. Human evidence. I understood then why people feared this house. Not because it lied but because it refused to. When Adiz came later that day, she didn't step inside. She stood at the threshold and looked at my face. You don't need to describe it, she said gently. I can see it. I wanted to apologize for doubting, for being late, for surviving when someone else hadn't. Instead, I whispered, she was here. And for the first time the house felt quiet. Not empty. Quiet. Like it had finally been heard. I went to the church because it was the last place I wanted to go. Power always hid behind holiness when it wanted to appear clean. Pastor Bamadil welcomed me with open arms and careful eyes. He spoke of forgiveness before I mentioned anything specific. Of healing. Of letting go. When I asked about my mother, he sighed like a man burdened by other people's pain. He said the church had intervened during a difficult period. That prayers had been said. That mistakes were made but intentions were good. I asked if prayers left scratch marks on walls. He didn't answer. Just told me to be careful about reopening wounds that had already served their purpose. I left the church feeling dirtier than when I entered. It was clear now, this hadn't been a secret kept by one family. It had been a system. Shared responsibility disguised as shared silence. The house hadn't stood alone all these years. It had been protected. Maintained. Watched. And my father had been part of it. Not the architect, perhaps. But a willing brick. That realization hollowed me out. Loving him suddenly felt like betrayal. Hating him felt like treason. Adiz didn't tell me what to feel. She just stayed. Sometimes presence is braver than advice. The warnings became clearer after that. Not dramatic threats. Subtle ones. A note slipped under my door suggesting I return to Lagos. A stranger watching the compound gate at night. Kunal begging me to stop before I destroyed everything our family worked for. I wanted to ask him whose everything he meant, but I already knew. Mine was expendable. My mother's had been. Truth always cost the people who least benefited from lies. I started documenting everything, photographs, copies, recordings. Adiz insisted we move slowly. Carefully. Truth survives longer when it's not rushed, she said. I hated how right she was. One evening, as we sat under the stars, she reached for my hand, not in promise, not in romance, but in solidarity. Whatever you choose, she said, don't do it alone. That was when I understood that love didn't always arrive as desire. Sometimes it arrived as courage shared between two people who refused to look away. I didn't know yet how much the truth would cost me. I only knew I was done pretending I could walk away unchanged. The house had already taken that option from me. The confirmation came wrapped in cowardice. A voice note. Not even a direct call. My aunt, the same one who'd held me at my mother's funeral, sent it after I pressed too hard one evening. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she didn't deny it. There was a child, she said. A boy. They said he died. But there was never a burial. Your father swore me to silence. I sat on the veranda, the phone on my lap, and listened to it over and over until the words stopped sounding like language and started feeling like wounds. I couldn't breathe. Not because I had a sibling I never knew, but because of what that silence meant. My mother had been taken, hidden, silenced, and then robbed of a child, and the world moved on as if it was normal. I thought of that tiny handprint on the wall. Was it his? Was it mine? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that something was stolen from us, something bigger than time. Adiz didn't say much when I told her. She just looked at me the way you look at someone watching a storm approach from the shore, unable to stop it but unwilling to walk away. She held my hand. I didn't cry. Not yet. My grief had become too sharp, too dry. That night I didn't sleep in the house. I sat on the compound floor until morning, legs folded, eyes on the sky, asking questions I didn't know how to phrase. Why me? Why now? What do I do with all this truth that no one wants to hear? When the sun rose, I knew. I couldn't leave. Not until the house was heard. Not until my mother was named. Not until the baby, my brother, was remembered. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about dignity. And I was the only one left with the spine to demand it. I returned to Lagos briefly, if only to gather what I needed: documents, contacts, fragments of the life I used to call stable. The moment I stepped into my apartment, everything felt off. The walls were too smooth. The noise too clean. I tried to fall back into routine, but it chafed like a borrowed shirt. My boss called me in for a chat, one that ended with veiled concerns about my state of mind and reputational risks. I understood the code. Word had spread about the village, about my refusal to sell, about the accusations I was stirring up. I was becoming inconvenient, disposable. And in that moment, I knew Lagos wouldn't save me. It would fold me into silence just like the village tried to. Power, whether in Igbata or a blazer, always knew how to close ranks. Before I left, I met with a retired journalist, someone Adiz had connected me with quietly. I handed him copies of the letters, photographs, even a transcript of my aunt's voice note. He listened without interrupting, face unreadable. They'll try to discredit you, he said plainly. But if this is real, and it sounds like it is, then this is not just a story. This is an indictment. I nodded. My voice didn't shake when I said, let them come. When I returned to Adoha 2 days later, the air felt heavier. Not in a supernatural way. In a political way. Like the soil had learned my name. The house welcomed me with its same stillness. I touched its walls and whispered, we're almost there. And I meant it. This wasn't the end. But it was the start of a reckoning. Her name was Nkiru. Not Madwoman. Not the village ghost. Not a riddle in torn wrappers. Nkiru Dyke. A nurse. A woman who had dared to report what she saw: my mother's confinement, the cries of the baby, the complicity of the church. For that, they took her license, called her unwell, and let her rot in silence. I learned all this from a faded hospital record, a dusty file buried in the corner of a long-neglected cabinet in Owerri General. The file confirmed everything. Witness statements retracted, mental evaluations requested by powerful men, her name redacted in court. My hands trembled as I read it. I wasn't just chasing shadows. I was following a trail paved in cruelty. When I returned to the village and placed the file in front of her, she looked at me like I'd returned her voice. You found me, she whispered. So maybe she can be found too. I promised her. Right there, in the middle of her shack, surrounded by rusted pans and flies, I promised her I would not bury this. Not like they wanted. Not like my father did. Even if I lose everything, I said, this truth will outlive them. She looked at me, tears crawling down skin that had weathered more than time, and she said, then I can finally rest. I left her that evening with a copy of her own name. Proof that she was never mad. Just punished for being louder than tradition allowed. That night I stared at the locked door one last time. Not in fear. In honor. Because the woman behind it had survived long enough for someone to remember her by name. I didn't call it a trial. But that's what it was. A quiet storm built from evidence, witness, and resolve. I submitted everything to the press, to a human rights NGO Adiz trusted, and to the local government office that pretended it didn't know the village existed. The blowback was immediate. Chief Alabi sent men to threaten Kunal. The church denied everything. People I'd once greeted on the road now avoided my eyes. But Adiz stayed beside me. When the news hit the radio, when the phrase captive cleansing ritual echoed across state lines, everything cracked open. Survivors came forward. Anonymous, cautious but real. The house was no longer just mine. It became a symbol. Of rot. Of buried grief. Of women who had been locked away and branded cursed for the sake of appearances. Adiz and I sat in the courtyard that night, the moon washing the compound in pale light. "Are you ready for what's next?" she asked. I nodded even though I wasn't. We didn't kiss. There was no dramatic confession. Just her hand resting on mine. A promise that whatever remained, ruin or justice, we'd face it together. The house, once silent, now stood tall, not because it was holy, but because it had finally been witnessed. I didn't sleep. I walked its halls, touched every door, every wall. "I see you," I whispered, "and I will never look away again. Not from this house. Not from the woman who bled in it. Not from the truth that nearly buried us all." I didn't sell the house. I restored it. Not to live in. Not to profit from. But to serve. With the help of a non-profit, we converted it into a local women's shelter and documentation center. Survivors come there now. They talk. They write. They name names. The room that once held my mother now holds testimonies. The scratches on the wall were preserved behind glass. I insisted. Let them see what silence looks like in claw marks. Let them remember. The villagers still walk past with side eyes. Some spit as they pass. Others bring offerings hoping to shift karma. But the house doesn't care about curses anymore. It has purpose now. It has breath again. As for me, I still carry the weight. Some nights I wake up hearing the lullaby. Some days I smell the perfume again. But I no longer feel haunted. I feel called. Adiz and I didn't rush into labels. We didn't need to. What we built wasn't soft. It was shaped by fire. And fire doesn't beg to be understood, it just burns and then clears the way. My name isn't just Toby Adniran anymore. It's the name of the boy who listened when a madwoman whispered, "Don't enter that house." And I did. And I didn't come out the same. I came out ready to never let another house eat the truth again.